The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the country club as Marcus Wellington III watched his bride-to-be storm out of their rehearsal dinner, her designer heels clicking furiously across the polished surface while 300 of Boston's elite sat in stunned silence. Victoria's voice had been rising for the past 10 minutes, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing wildly as she berated the catering staff about the temperature of the soup, the placement of the centerpieces, the fact that her champagne glass had been filled a millimeter too high. The breaking point had come when she'd screamed at a young server for walking too close to her Vera Wang dress, calling her clumsy and worthless, before hurling her glass to the floor in a fit of rage that would be talked about in Boston society circles for months. But Marcus wasn't looking at Victoria's dramatic exit. His eyes were fixed on the young woman in a wrinkled server's uniform who was quietly sweeping up the glass, her hands trembling as she tried to make herself invisible. Something about the way she moved, the careful precision of someone who knew what it meant to clean up other people's messes, struck him like lightning. While his future wife had just humiliated someone for doing their job, this woman was cleaning up the mess with dignity, never once looking up at the crowd of wealthy spectators who were watching her like she was part of the evening's entertainment. "Leave it," Marcus said softly, kneeling beside her. The server looked up, startled. Her name tag read Sarah. She had kind eyes, the kind that had seen struggle but hadn't lost their warmth. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll have this cleaned up in just a moment." "I said leave it." Marcus stood, his tuxedo worth more than most people's monthly salary, and extended his hand to help her up. "What's your story, Sarah?" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention from a man she'd heard described as one of New England's most eligible bachelors. "I don't have a story worth telling, sir." But Marcus saw something different. In a room full of people who had everything handed to them, here was someone who understood the value of work, of persistence, of earning every single thing she had. "Everyone has a story worth telling. What do you do when you're not here serving people who probably don't deserve to be served?" Sarah glanced around nervously, aware that dozens of eyes were still watching the unfolding drama. "I'm in my final semester at community college. Business administration. I work 3 jobs to pay for it." She paused, then added quietly, "My mother needs medication that insurance won't cover. The cancer treatments are expensive, and the part-time jobs barely cover rent and groceries, let alone her medical bills. Some nights I study until 3 in the morning because it's the only quiet time I can find between my shifts at the diner, the grocery store, and here." Marcus felt something twist in his chest. This woman was carrying burdens that would crush most people. Yet here she was, pursuing an education, working multiple jobs, caring for her sick mother, and still maintaining enough grace to clean up broken glass without complaint. Meanwhile, Victoria had just thrown a tantrum because her ice sculpture wasn't the precise shade of blue she'd demanded. And in that moment, something shifted in Marcus's world. Here he was, about to marry a woman who had never worked a day in her life, who saw waitstaff as invisible furniture, who had just thrown a tantrum because the ice sculpture wasn't the exact shade of blue she'd specified. And here was Sarah, juggling 3 jobs, caring for her mother, pursuing an education with determination that his privileged circle couldn't even comprehend. "What would you do?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying across the silent room. "If someone gave you a real opportunity?" Sarah's eyes widened. I don't understand." Marcus looked around at the faces staring at them. His parents, red-faced with embarrassment. Victoria's parents, calculating the social implications. His business associates, probably wondering if the stress had finally gotten to him. But for the first time in his 32 years, Marcus felt absolutely clear about something. "I'm starting a new venture," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A consulting firm focused on helping small businesses grow. I need someone who understands what it means to work for something. Someone who knows the value of $1 because they've had to earn every one." He looked directly at Sarah. "I'm offering you a position as my business partner. Equal stakes. Are you interested?" The room erupted. His mother actually gasped. Someone dropped their fork. Victoria's voice could be heard from the hallway, shrieking about humiliation and lawyers. But Sarah just stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." "Because," Marcus said, feeling more alive than he had in years. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who take everything for granted. I want to work with someone who appreciates opportunity because they know how rare it is. Have you ever had a moment when you realized you were living someone else's dream instead of your own? Marcus had built his fortune managing his family's investments, moving money around for people who already had too much of it. But watching Sarah's hands shake as she contemplated a future she'd never dared imagine, he understood what he'd been missing: purpose, real impact, the chance to build something meaningful with someone who would value it as much as he did. 6 months later, Wellington and Associates was born, but not in the gleaming downtown office Marcus's father had offered. Instead, they rented a small space above a diner in Sarah's neighborhood, where the rent was affordable and the coffee was strong. The contrast couldn't have been sharper, from the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of Wellington Industries to a cramped office with second-hand furniture and a coffee maker that had seen better days. But something about the energy in that small space, the sound of the neighborhood coming alive each morning, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery next door, felt more real than anything Marcus had experienced in his 32 years. Sarah brought something to the partnership that Marcus's Ivy League MBA never could have taught him: the ability to connect with people who were struggling, who needed help but couldn't afford the fancy consulting firms that charged $5,000 just for an initial consultation. She understood what it meant to count every penny, to weigh the cost of hiring help against the risk of trying to figure everything out alone. More importantly, she had the patience to sit with people in their uncertainty, to listen to their fears without judgment, and to help them find solutions that worked for their actual lives, not some theoretical business model. Their first client was Mrs. Rodriguez, who owned a small bakery that was failing despite making the best tres leches cake in the city. When she first walked into their office, she was carrying a shoebox full of receipts and wearing the kind of worry that comes from watching a dream slowly die. She'd inherited the bakery from her late husband, along with recipes that had been in his family for generations, but she'd never learned the business side of running a restaurant. The numbers made no sense to her, the suppliers were demanding payment she didn't have, and she was 3 months behind on rent. Sarah spent hours with her, not just analyzing the financial statements but learning about her story, her dreams, her fears about losing the business her late husband had helped her start. Together, they discovered that Mrs. Rodriguez was selling her cakes for half what they were worth, afraid that raising prices would drive away customers who were already struggling. They developed a marketing strategy that honored the bakery's authenticity while expanding its reach, creating a catering service for local events and partnering with nearby coffee shops to sell her pastries. Within 6 months, Mrs. Rodriguez had 3 locations and was training her daughter to take over the business someday. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked Marcus one evening as they worked late, surrounded by financial projections and business plans. "Walking away from all that wealth, that life?" Marcus looked up from his laptop. Over the months, he'd watched Sarah transform. The nervous server had become a confident businesswoman, but she'd never lost her compassion, her ability to see the person behind the problem. "You know what I regret? Almost missing this. Almost spending my life in meetings about nothing with people who contribute nothing." But success didn't come without challenges. Marcus's family cut off his trust fund, certain he'd come crawling back within a year. His father called him weekly for the first 3 months, alternating between anger and disappointment, unable to understand why his son would throw away a fortune to play charity worker with some waitress. His mother stopped taking his calls altogether, too embarrassed to explain to her country club friends why her son was running a business above a diner instead of managing the family investments. Victoria married his former best friend in a wedding that made the society pages, with headlines like, "Boston heiress finds love after dramatic split." The photos showed her in a different Vera Wang gown, smiling radiantly as she posed with someone who looked exactly like Marcus, but without the inconvenient conscience. There were nights when they lived on ramen noodles and coffee, when they weren't sure they could make rent, when every potential client felt like a lifeline they might not catch. The stress of those early months showed in different ways. Marcus lost weight from skipping meals to save money, while Sarah developed a persistent cough from working too many hours in the poorly ventilated office. They took turns having breakdowns, one holding the business together while the other fell apart, then switching roles the next week. The learning curve was brutal. Marcus had to unlearn years of corporate thinking, discovering that most small business owners didn't want complex strategies and PowerPoint presentations. They wanted someone to sit across from them at their kitchen table and help them figure out how to make payroll next month. Sarah had to overcome years of feeling like she wasn't smart enough or educated enough to give advice to business owners, even though her instincts were often better than Marcus's formal training. During their darkest moment, when their biggest client decided to go with a more established firm and two others canceled their contracts in the same week, Sarah found Marcus sitting on the floor of their office at midnight, staring at bills they couldn't pay. The rejection letter from their biggest prospect was crumpled beside him, and he'd been sitting there for hours, questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. "Maybe everyone was right," he said quietly, his voice hollow with exhaustion and doubt. "Maybe I'm just a rich kid playing at being a businessman. Maybe I don't know anything about the real world, and I'm just dragging you down with me." Sarah sat down beside him, her presence steady and warm in the cold office. She'd been working 16-hour days, splitting her time between client meetings and night classes, surviving on determination and coffee. Her mother's condition was getting worse, the medical bills were mounting, and there were days when the smart thing would have been to walk away, to take a stable job with benefits and a predictable paycheck. "You know what I learned working those 3 jobs?" she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The difference between people who make it and people who don't isn't talent or luck or even money. It's the willingness to get up one more time than you fall down." She smiled at him, that same kind smile he'd first noticed while she was cleaning up broken glass. "Besides, you're not just a rich kid anymore. You're my partner, and I don't partner with quitters." That night changed something between them. They'd been business partners, friends, allies in an unlikely venture. But sitting on that office floor, facing failure together, they became something more. Not romantic, their relationship was built on respect and shared purpose rather than attraction, but something deeper than friendship. They became family, the kind you choose rather than the kind you're born into. How many times in life do we face moments that test not just our resolve, but our identity? Marcus had always defined himself by his family's expectations, their wealth, their social standing. But building something from nothing with Sarah taught him who he really was beneath all those layers of privilege and assumption. They got back up. They refined their approach, focusing on businesses that larger firms ignored. Family restaurants struggling with rising costs, local service providers competing against national chains, immigrant entrepreneurs with big dreams and small budgets who were navigating language barriers and unfamiliar regulations. Word spread slowly but surely through communities that big consulting firms never even visited. Their clients didn't just succeed. They thrived, and they told their friends, their families, their communities about the 2 people who had believed in them when no one else would. Marcus learned to speak Spanish so he could communicate better with their growing Latino client base. Sarah earned her real estate license so she could help clients find affordable commercial space. They both learned that success wasn't about having all the answers. It was about caring enough to find them together, about being willing to get their hands dirty, to sit in cramped restaurant kitchens and dusty warehouses, to understand the real challenges their clients faced every day. 5 years passed like a blur of long days and late nights, of celebrating client victories and mourning the occasional failure, of slowly building something that mattered. Wellington and Associates became the go-to consulting firm for small businesses throughout New England. They'd helped hundreds of entrepreneurs achieve their dreams, creating thousands of jobs in communities that big business had forgotten. Sarah had paid off her mother's medical bills, bought a small house 3 blocks from their office, and earned her MBA through night school while continuing to work full-time. Marcus had discovered that building wealth was far more satisfying when it meant building it for others too, when every dollar earned represented a family saved, a dream realized, a community strengthened. Then came the call that changed everything. "Marcus Wellington?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Jennifer Chun from Morrison Industries. We'd like to discuss acquiring your firm." Morrison Industries, the biggest consulting conglomerate on the East Coast, the company that had started poaching their clients 2 years earlier. Marcus almost hung up, but something made him listen. "We've been watching your work," Jennifer continued. Your client retention rate is unprecedented. Your results speak for themselves. We're prepared to make a very generous offer. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at Morrison's gleaming headquarters in downtown Boston, the kind of building Marcus used to take for granted when it was his world. As their taxi pulled up to the 40-story tower of glass and steel, Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The lobby was all marble and mahogany, designed to intimidate rather than welcome, filled with the kind of aggressive wealth that announced itself in every polished surface and imported fixture. They prepared carefully for this meeting, knowing it could be the opportunity that changed everything for them and for their clients. Sarah wore her best suit, the one she'd bought for her MBA graduation, while Marcus chose a conservative tie that wouldn't look out of place in this world he'd once inhabited. But as they rode the elevator to the 52nd floor, passing floors of cubicles and conference rooms, Marcus realized how much he'd changed. The man who'd grown up in buildings like this now felt claustrophobic in them, longing for their small office above the diner where the windows actually opened and you could hear life happening on the street below. They walked into the conference room expecting to meet with junior executives and maybe a mid-level VP. Instead, they found themselves face to face with the CEO of Morrison Industries, sitting at the head of a mahogany table that probably cost more than their first year's rent, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Boston Harbor that was meant to remind visitors of exactly how powerful the person across from them really was. "Mr. Wellington, Ms. Johnson," the CEO said, standing to greet them. "Thank you for coming." But Marcus never heard the name. He was staring absolutely frozen, because the CEO of Morrison Industries, the woman who had built a consulting empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was Victoria. His former fiancée, the woman who had stormed out of their rehearsal dinner 5 years earlier. Victoria smiled, and it wasn't entirely friendly. "Hello, Marcus." Surprised. Her transformation was remarkable and unsettling. Gone was the petulant socialite who had thrown champagne glasses and screamed at waitstaff. In her place sat a woman who radiated the kind of controlled power that came from years of proving herself in rooms full of men who'd initially dismissed her as daddy's little princess. Her hair was shorter now, styled in a sharp bob that framed features that had grown harder, more angular. She wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, but she wore it like armor rather than decoration. The room seemed to spin as Marcus processed the implications. Sarah looked between them, clearly sensing the history but not understanding its full scope, watching as 5 years of carefully built confidence seemed to evaporate from her partner's face. "I see you're wondering how this happened," Victoria continued, her voice smooth as silk, each word precisely chosen for maximum impact. "Well, after our dramatic parting, I decided I needed to prove something. To myself, to my parents, to you. I started at the bottom at Morrison, worked my way up. Turns out, I had quite a talent for business when I actually applied myself instead of just spending daddy's money on designer shoes and charity galas." She gestured around the conference room, at the view of Boston Harbor, at the obvious symbols of her success, the awards lining the walls, the photos with senators and CEOs, the stack of financial magazines with her face on the cover. "Funny thing about being humiliated in front of 300 people. It either breaks you or it forges you into something stronger. I chose stronger." She gestured around the conference room, at the view of Boston Harbor, at the obvious symbols of her success. "And now I'm in a position to offer you something very interesting. I want to buy Wellington and Associates. Full acquisition. You'll both stay on as consultants, of course. Very well-compensated consultants." Marcus found his voice. "Why?" "Because you were right." The admission seemed to cost Victoria something. "That night, when you chose her over me, you were right. I was everything you said I was without saying it. Spoiled, entitled, focused on all the wrong things. But unlike you, I didn't run away from my privilege. I used it. I learned from it. And now I'm offering you the chance to take your little social project and scale it properly." Sarah spoke for the first time since the introductions. "With respect, MS? Morrison. Victoria Morrison now. I took my mother's maiden name when I took over the company. With respect, Ms. Morrison, Wellington and Associates isn't a social project. It's a business built on relationships, on understanding our clients' real needs. That doesn't scale the way you're thinking. Victoria's smile sharpened. Everything scales, Ms. Johnson, with the right systems and the right leadership. Your methods are admirable, but imagine what you could accomplish with real resources. Real reach, real power. The offer was staggering. More money than Marcus had ever dreamed of, even with his trust fund. Security for Sarah, for her mother, for all their employees. The chance to help thousands more small businesses instead of dozens. But as Victoria outlined her vision, Marcus felt something cold settling in his stomach. Corporate efficiency, standardized processes, scalable solutions. All the buzzwords that sounded impressive but meant turning their personal, relationship-based approach into just another corporate machine. "We need time to think about it," Sarah said diplomatically. "Of course," Victoria replied. "Take all the time you need. But understand, this offer has an expiration date. The market is changing. Small consulting firms like yours are becoming obsolete. You can either evolve with us or—" She didn't need to finish the threat. They all understood. Walking out of that building, Marcus felt like he was drowning. The weight of the decision, the complexity of facing Victoria again, the implications for their clients and employees, all of it pressed down on him like water filling his lungs. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked as they sat in their car in the parking garage. The contrast between Morrison's luxury and their modest Honda Civic suddenly feeling significant. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "Part of me wonders if she's right. If we're being naive, thinking we can stay small and personal while the world gets bigger and more complicated." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the tower of glass and steel they just left. "Can I tell you something? Before I met you, I thought success meant getting enough money to stop worrying about money. But these 5 years, watching Mrs. Rodriguez expand her bakery, helping the Johnsons save their hardware store, seeing families keep their businesses and their dreams, that's not something you can scale. That's something you protect." But the pressure was real. Over the next month, Victoria's prediction began coming true. 2 of their biggest clients were approached by Morrison's sales team with offers too good to refuse. A 3rd client was poached by a competing firm that suddenly seemed to know all their strategies and pricing. "She's squeezing us," Sarah said one evening as they reviewed their dwindling client list. "This isn't just business. This is personal." Marcus stared at the numbers on his laptop screen. They could survive for maybe 6 more months at this rate. After that, they'd have to lay off employees, people who had trusted them, who had families depending on their jobs. "Maybe we should take the offer," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him sharply. "You don't mean that, don't I? Look at these numbers, Sarah. Look at what's happening to our clients, our people. Maybe Victoria's right. Maybe we're being stubborn and naive. Or maybe," Sarah said, her voice fierce with conviction, "we're being tested. Maybe this is when we find out what we're really made of." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked the streets of Sarah's neighborhood, past the diner where they'd had their first business meeting, past Mrs. Rodriguez's original bakery, past dozens of small businesses they'd helped over the years. Each storefront told a story of someone who had refused to give up, who had found a way to thrive against the odds. He thought about the man he'd been 5 years ago, standing in that country club surrounded by people who had never fought for anything. He thought about the choice he'd made, not just to help Sarah, but to help himself become someone worth being. And then he knew what they had to do. The next morning, he found Sarah already at the office, working on a proposal for a new client, a young immigrant who wanted to start a food truck business. "I have an idea," Marcus said. "What if we don't fight Victoria's game? What if we change the rules entirely?" Sarah looked up, curious. "Community investment," Marcus continued, his excitement building. "Instead of trying to compete with Morrison for big corporate clients, what if we created a fund? Local investors supporting local businesses. We provide the consulting, the community provides the capital. Everyone shares in the success." It was radical. It was risky. It meant giving up the safety of traditional client relationships for something completely untested. But it was also brilliant. Within 6 months, The Wellington Community Investment Fund had raised $2 million from local investors who understood the value of supporting their own neighborhoods. Instead of having clients, they had partners. Instead of competing for market share, they were creating new markets. Victoria's attempts at poaching became irrelevant when there was nothing to poach. Their business model was so different, so integrated with the community, that corporate giants couldn't replicate it even if they wanted to. The day Marcus realized they'd not just survived but thrived was the day he got a call from Jennifer Chun, Victoria's assistant. "Ms. Morrison would like to schedule another meeting," Jennifer said. "She has a new proposition." This time, when Marcus and Sarah walked into Morrison Industries, they weren't walking in as potential acquisitions. They were walking in as equals, as leaders of something Victoria's corporate empire couldn't touch. Victoria looked older, more tired than she had 6 months earlier. The confidence was still there, but it seemed forced now, brittle. "I underestimated you," she said without preamble. "Both of you. I thought I could force you to see reason, to accept that bigger is always better." "And now?" Sarah asked. Victoria gestured toward the windows, toward the city beyond. "Now I see that maybe I'm the one who needs to see reason. Morrison Industries is successful, profitable, growing every quarter. But we're not. We don't." She struggled with the words. "We don't matter. Not the way you matter." The admission hung in the air like smoke. "I'm not here to buy you out," Victoria continued. "I'm here to ask if you'd consider partnering with us. Not acquisition, partnership. Let us learn from what you've built." It was Marcus's turn to be surprised. "What are you really asking, Victoria?" "I'm asking if you'd teach me how to build something that matters. How to create value instead of just extracting it." Her voice was quieter now, more vulnerable than he'd ever heard it. "I'm asking if you'd help me become the person I should have been 5 years ago." Sarah and Marcus exchanged a glance. In that look was 5 years of partnership, of trust, of shared struggles and victories. And in that glance, they both knew the answer. "We'll consider it," Sarah said carefully. "But it would have to be on our terms. Community first. People first. Profit follows purpose, not the other way around." Victoria nodded slowly. "I understand. And I'm willing to learn." 6 months later, the Morrison-Wellington Community Partnership was announced. A hybrid model that brought corporate resources to community-focused investing. Victoria didn't just put her money behind the venture. She put herself behind it, learning to work with small business owners the way Sarah had taught Marcus to do years earlier. Watching Victoria struggle with her first client meeting, seeing her fumble through a conversation with a nervous restaurant owner who barely spoke English, Marcus felt an unexpected emotion. Compassion. Here was someone else learning what he'd learned. Discovering that real success wasn't about having all the answers but about caring enough to find them together. "Do you think people can really change?" Sarah asked him one evening as they watched Victoria patiently help an elderly man understand a business plan. Her designer suit replaced by jeans and sneakers, her corporate polish traded for genuine interest. Marcus thought about the man he'd been in that country club, the choices he'd made, the life he'd built. "I think people can become who they were always meant to be, if they're brave enough to let go of who they thought they should be." Years later, when business schools studied the Wellington model, when communities across the country replicated their approach, when Victoria Morrison became known not for corporate acquisitions but for community development, people would ask Marcus about that night. About the moment he chose a stranger over his bride. About the decision that changed everything. But Marcus would always say the real choice wasn't between Sarah and Victoria. The real choice was between the person he'd been raised to be and the person he chose to become. The rest was just the story of what happens when you stop living up to other people's expectations and start living up to your own. And Sarah? Sarah would smile and remind people that sometimes the best business decisions aren't business decisions at all. Sometimes they're human decisions. Sometimes they're heart decisions. Sometimes they're the choice to see potential instead of problems, to choose partnership over power, to build something that matters more than something that merely succeeds. Because at the end of the day, success isn't measured in dollars or market share or corner offices. It's measured in the lives you touch, the dreams you help build, the communities you strengthen, and the person you become along the way. The question isn't whether you'll face moments that test who you really are. The question is, when those moments come, who will you choose to be? What would you risk to become the person you were meant to be? What opportunities are you walking past because they don't fit the life others expect you to live? And when you look back on your story, will you be proud of the choices you made? Or will you wonder what might have been if you'd been brave enough to choose differently? The champagne glass may shatter, but sometimes the breaking is just the sound of a new beginning.